Morning, Chris.
Good morning, Anthony. Imagine for a moment NASA's innovation budget is in your hands. What do? You build some rockets?
Go to Vegas and put it all on black.
You'd be a kind of a high roller at that point. Does that sound intimidating? It sounds intimidating to me. But for Nick Jain, it's just another day in the office. From running IdeaScale to advising nonprofits, Nick has mastered turning budgets into blueprint for success. Nick is the CEO of IdeaScale. Welcome, Nick. We're talking about budgets today. This is great.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's exciting. It's sexy. It's fun.
Money is fun. Okay, money is fun. Having a good budget is a good way to make a lot of money for your organization.
It is a terrific way. So let's just start with the high level. First of all, you were just giving us your backstory right before we started. You were the first phase of your career. You were a theoretical mathematician, which brings the IQ, like you quadrupled the IQ level of this podcast right there. Just you immediately have made us all smart. So Anthony and I are going to shut up a lot today. That's actually not true. We can't do that. So
I think we're both going to be asking you for jobs after the podcast.
Yeah.
Actually,
we are hiring. So
there you go. Exactly. Let's just start talking about budgeting. Why is it important? What is this thing about? Why are we here taking your valuable time, not our valuable time, but your valuable time to talk to early stage companies and founders about budgeting?
So the good news is I've budgeted my time to show up here today.
Oh, well done.
You missed Tuesday's episode. That's exactly what we talked about.
Exactly.
Time budgeting. Yeah.
Well, jokes aside, look, the reason budgets are important is because resources are finite. You have a finite amount of money, of time, whatever. And if you don't allocate it to the things that matter, stuff eventually goes wrong and you run out of that precious resource. And again, that can be money, time, people, love, whatever it is. You have a finite amount of time or a finite amount of it. So therefore you have to budget it.
Wait. You said a finite amount of love?
Yeah. So look,
this is my country music side coming out. Nick, you can't have too much money and you can't have too much love, Nick.
I'm not saying you can't have too much of it, but nobody does. Even Elon Musk, right? He, potentially risked a lot of his money on Twitter, which, the jury's still out on, right? So not even the richest man in the world still has a finite amount of money.
I love it. All right. So talk to us about the theory. And again, I'm looking at your bio that I completely butchered. But you went to Harvard Business School, math degree from Dartmouth. I can't even say it. So complicated. Dartmouth. Exactly. But you really specialize like logic and creativity in budgeting. Explain what that is. Like, just start with a high level. How should I, as a founder, think about budgeting?
Okay, so budgeting is basically the idea that you, again, have this finite resource, let's say money, right? You got some venture capital, you got some seed funding from friends and family, whatever it is, your own life savings, you got a finite amount of it, and you have to take your company from here to where it needs to be in a year or 6 months or whatever, with only the resources you have in front of you, right? And if you don't create a budget, a plan basically of how you're going to use those resources or get more resources in, you're eventually going to run out of that resource. And it's really bad for any company to run out of money, because the worst time to go raise money or to ask friends, family, venture capitalists for money is when you actually need it. You want to ask from a position of strength if you have to ask, rather than from a position of weakness. And a lot of young companies find themselves in a situation where they didn't think ahead. They're out there just spending crazy amounts of money, and then they end up in really terrible situations. And you've seen this, in Silicon Valley over the last 2 years. All these startups that were billion-dollar companies are having their valuations slashed by like 70, 80%. And they're going back, and the founders now have worked for 10 years and they are like, $100 million in debt. That really sucks for a founder when you made no money, you worked there for 10 years and you screwed up. And these
Right,
are
and
billion-dollar
now
companies.
at least theoretically, you're like, oh, and I owe my creditors $35 million. Like, that's terrific. Anthony, I think what Nick is saying is that it's a resource mindset. And so I think one of the things that you said, Nick, which is really valuable, is start with the idea of what resources you have available to you. Does that resonate for you, Anthony?
Yeah. There's a quote that pops in my head though, and I'd love for you to talk about this, Nick. So there's this theoretical notion of budget, right? And math is invariably involved. I love the math quote. What is the quote? I don't want to get it wrong. Math is the only subject where you can buy 60 watermelons and nobody understands why. Look at budgets and like, okay, so why? Like, there's not a why behind it. So yeah, you need to understand the idea, but it's got to be rooted in some kind of reality. You're not buying 60 watermelons when you're creating a budget.
That is your staff calling you to get you the hell off this podcast right this second. It's like, bail out, Nick. Go.
Give me one second. I
Technical
thought I put it on
difficulties.
D&D. I'm going to just do that right now. Just in case. There we go. So the why actually is going, you're going into like college level budgeting, which is now ROI in finance, which is okay. A budget is just a plan. The finance theory is like why the plan is right or wrong, right? So theoretically, you buy 60 watermelons because it gives you more than 60 watermelons worth of joy or utility in the economics jargon, right?
I was going to say, we're getting very macroeconomics-y here.
Okay. So you could buy, theoretically, it could be a great budget idea for you to buy 60 watermelons if you have 150 people and you believe that there's 2.5, each person will eat 40% of a watermelon. That could potentially be good math. But notice the why that we created for that budget was we need to feed 150 people and we're only going to feed them watermelons. It's a really terrible summer party. But usually budgets, well-run budgets, work backwards from the why to the plan. So it's, okay, we need to feed 150 people or we need to sell, $1 million of product. That means we need to hire 10 salespeople who each need to sell $100,000, and each salesperson is going to cost, $50,000, whatever that is. Usually you start with goals and then work backwards to match the goals to the resources you have available. And the budget is the meeting point that hopefully aligns what you have available, the resources, to what the goals you want to achieve over that time span.
I think that was really well said, Anthony. I think that is really something that we see all the time, which is a founder will walk into the room and go, here are my goals and here's my budget. And those two things have never met in the middle, right? Like they're like, here's my financial plan. And remember, Nick, every single startup financial plan has $1 billion valuation by year 5, usually, sometimes by year 3, right? But what's your take on that, Anthony? Does that resonate as far as?
Yeah, I was honestly having a lot of trouble following the math.
It was my understanding that there would be no math.
I was going to pull that out as my understanding.
There were no X's, Y's, and Z's in my statement. There was no X's, Y's, and Z's, as I promised.
I mean, I don't really have like. You're asking me to add something to a Dartmouth and Harvard grad. There's like
but I think
no notes.
The main piece here is we start to frame this conversation, this argument up, which is we know that what you just said is dead right, Nick, which is in business, we need to sit down. We need to come up with where it is that we're trying to go. That's its own exercise. It's its own business planning. It's how do I meet those objectives? And then there's a financial plan. And those two things, particularly for a lot of early stage founders, rarely meet in the middle. And to your point, Nick, a budget is a how you're going to achieve those goals, right?
Mm.
I mean, I think that's basically the point where we can say, okay, I get it now, which is now we start to ask the question, all right, Nick, how do we do that? What are the practical steps? How do I start to think about that as a founder?
How is it not just numbers and boxes? Like, how do you really think about? Which
is quite literally how I built my first pro forma, right? Like I just threw shit in because it looks good to me.
Exactly right. How do you whenever whether or not you're going to seek venture capital, or if you're just making a budget for you to operate your business on, you should be making your pro forma to operate your business on, not to produce what you think venture capitalists are going to want to see, right? So how do you make it an actual plan versus a hope?
Sure. By the way, sometimes the goal, the business objective is simply to create something that the venture capitalists want to see. That is a
That's fair.
legitimate and laudable goal, right?
That's fair. Unfortunately, true, but it's fair.
Yeah, I'm not commenting on the whether it's good or wrong or right or wrong. It's simply sometimes that is the goal.
But like we at this point, Nick, we've done like, I don't know, what is this, episode 38? I'm telling people, like, don't fucking do that. Build yourself a real business. Well, fucking listen to venture capitalists. They just want to see numbers and shit. Like, come build a good business for you, Mr. Founder. Go ahead. Sorry for my
So look, Anthony, you said numbers and boxes, right? I think in building a budget, you at some level you can't avoid numbers and boxes. You have to have, right? But as a founder or someone who doesn't necessarily have that skill set or hasn't built that skill set, right? If you're not a finance, accounting, budget person or a math person, you can just start with pictures, right? The pictures can be, here's the business goal I want to achieve. I want to sell $1 million of stuff. To sell $1 million of stuff, I need a few things. I need some marketing. I need some sales. I need some product. And you can say, okay, here's the qualitative inputs I need to achieve that output. And then at some level, you have to say, how much of that qualitative input? Do I need one salesperson? Do I need 5? Do I need 50? And you have to start putting numbers to that. Now, the good news, and I think one thing that a lot of founders, do poorly but can fix is, look, if you're not good at that, that's okay. Call someone who is. You probably have someone in your network that can look at your budget and tell you, hey, the math doesn't add up. Or are you sure you can hire 5 salespeople for $5,000 a piece? Because that probably isn't true at anywhere in the world that you can hire a salesperson for $5,000 a year.
But I mean, Nick, this is really the great point. I think this is kind of we've finally gotten to the heart of it, which is like, okay, we know this needs to relate to goals. But when I built my first pro forma, I didn't know how much shit cost. I was a corporate dude that just walked out, and I knew how much I got paid. I didn't know how anybody, my employees, they got paid. But I didn't know anything else. What was that life experience, Anthony? Like, when you built your first pro forma, where did you find the information you needed to get somewhat realistic? Because that's the piece that I think a lot of early stage founders miss on.
When I built my first pro forma, I had already sold 3 companies. So
you're a terrible example. God damn it.
Terrible. Yeah. Don't ask me. My answer to that today would be, and I would use it now, would be, I mean, ChatGPT actually can give you some pretty good answers on what you should be budgeting for when, especially in your regions. Like, it's a damn good research tool for building a performance.
I think you're right now. And this is a great point. Nick, what do you think? Like, so getting that, a lot of times we ask whether or not the budget, passes the smell test. And to your point, like, hey, I have $15,000 to spend in sales and marketing. But I expect to sell $40 billion worth of product, within year 3, right? How do you start to figure out?
It's doable.
And a lot of those, like, they come in the world of finance. A lot of those are ratios. Like, where do you find that information? If you're an early stage founder, where would you go to find that?
So, okay, for me, Nick, I was a finance guy in Wall Street. I'm really good at this stuff. So I know this stuff like the back of my hand. So I'm not a good example, but exactly what Anthony said. In the modern day, go ask ChatGPT. And the beautiful thing about ChatGPT is not, or Gemini or Anthropic or whatever these LLMs are, right? I'm not here.
We've been talking about Anthony. I've been talking about Grok.
I know what Grok is. Well, actually, no, what Grok is.
I just learned that it's going to burn more energy than like Los Angeles.
Do you know where the word grok comes from as a super nerdy thing?
No, I don't actually.
I did, but remind me.
It's from a novel called Stranger in a Strange Land.
Yes. Yeah.
I love the fact, like, God, this is like the three of us.
It's a very famous novel by Robert Heinlein. I think he's the same guy who wrote Starship Troopers and stuff. That was his like magnum opus. So like for an early
using
stage
AI to do research. Yeah.
But more than that, actually. So AI, like level one is you could use the internet to do research, right? Like 5 years ago, I would check on Glassdoor for, hey, what are wages in Mexico or Wisconsin or India, right? Today, you can ask ChatGPT to do that, but you can actually go a step further. These LLM tools are smart enough that they can analyze your budget. So you can say,
Wow.
hey, and I'll give you a really practical example. Here's my budget. What do you think of it, right? I'll give a very practical example. So I'm about to do some home renovations to try and save energy costs, right? Get some windows done, add some sealant or whatever. I'm very good at the math, but I know nothing about home renovations, right? I don't know about energy savings.
How much does it actually cost?
Right? So what I did was I put, here's how much the refurbishment company or the repair company is going to charge me. Here's my typical energy bill. Walk me through how I build a budget for whether this is a good idea or not. And ChatGPT actually built the budget for me and sanity checked my math, right? So you don't have, it's not just that you can use it as a research tool. You can actually use these tools nowadays for doing the analysis for you.
It is remarkable. And I have not used an LLM yet on budgeting, but
I use it for pretty much
really
everything
cool.
nowadays, right? Not just research. Like I help it like develop personality profiles. I help, use it to write code. I use it for almost anything in my,
I admittedly have used it. I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before to help me with an argument with my wife. I'll role play with ChatGPT, her point of view and my point of view, and argue with ChatGPT before I go have the conversation with Shauna. Anyway, that's way off topic.
I know. It's good that Shauna has already heard enough from you and doesn't watch our podcast. That's terrific.
I still don't win any arguments, but at least I don't lose them as badly as I used to. So I'm curious, Nick, how do founders strike a balance between their inherent optimistic growth plans versus having real financial and pessimistic the reality of what the market's going to say? So how do you balance that ambition versus pessimism in a budget?
I'll start with the principle. Realists don't start companies, right? It is
that's exactly right.
No, like and
that is the quote
people
of
don't
the
start
day.
companies, Nick.
That is such a realists don't start companies. That is the nugget, Chris.
Yeah, that's it right there.
I say this tongue in cheek, but actually, if you look at the research from a pure like mathematical, is it a good life decision to start a company? It's negative expected value. You can go to some big corporate job and make $200,000, $300,000 a year and not work too hard and be a generic middle manager. And that's actually true for large portions of corporate America, right? And that's a lot of money where you basically can't get fired unless, there's mass layoffs. That's pretty good versus, you start if you start a company, the 1 year failure rate of small business in the United States is 67%. 67% of businesses that are started today will be gone within a year from now, right? And that is true for both these Silicon Valley startups as well as if you're starting your local restaurant, So if you actually do the math, it's a terrible idea to start a business unless you believe irrational things. So that's okay. A budget
You're delusional. We call it delusion. Yeah.
But it's okay, right? There's a quote, a joke I heard as a kid that the irrational man, the rational man adapts himself to the world. The irrational man adapts the world to him. Therefore, all progress depends on the irrational man, right? Crazy people cause progress. That's okay. But to go to the budget, right? You can't change the fact that you're irrational. Just live with it. You're irrationally optimistic. That's going to show in your budget. The question is, even if your assumptions are irrational or overly optimistic, are the causal pathways or the logic true, right? So for example, you can say, look, I'm going to sell $10 million of business in my first year of business. Probably a little, probably overly optimistic, whatever. But are you saying you're going to do so with zero sales and marketing investment? That seems like a logical break. So I think when the founders are building these budgets, it's okay for them to be optimistic. They are optimistic people, but they need to make sure there aren't logical breaks in that business plan that is implicit in their budget.
One of the things you talked about, Nick, and I really like this, and something that we've been playing with as far as ideas, is that within a budget, almost always we talk about a budget as far as money goes. But you mentioned early on, I just wanted to dig into it a little bit, that you also need to think about the amount of time and energy you have to put into any given project and use that as some sort of a budgeting, at least mentally. Did I get that right?
Yes. So I do that myself, but I'll give a more tangible example in terms of constructing a company. So we have salespeople, right? And I work backwards
I'm
from
sorry.
yeah. Oh
No, I'm sorry that you have salespeople. Yeah, keep
Yeah,
going.
I was like, why,
Hey.
Anthony? Are you leaving? Did we offend you? Or like, it's taken me 38 episodes to actually offend you.
So
Yeah.
we're planning for 2025 for what our business goals and salespeople are. Okay, we said, look, here's how much they need to sell over the course of the year. Okay, and here's their salary. That's the money part of it, but or the budgeting of their compensation. But let's work backwards. If they need to sell $1 million of business each, that means they need to sell $87,000 every month. If they need to sell $87,000 every month, here's how many meetings they need to do every week. In order to hit this many meetings a week, they need to hit this many emails, emails or cold calls a day. And that means, if you do 1 minute a call and 5 seconds an email, right, you have to work backwards to, okay, how do you achieve the business goal? Because we were actually budgeting their time kind of on a weekly basis. And that's something very practical and we had to make sure that was possible, because if the math said, hey, they have to write an email every 2.5 milliseconds, then we've done something really bad at budgeting their time, because that's impossible. Even machines won't be writing emails every 2.5 milliseconds, right? ChatGPT doesn't output text that fast. So when you're creating with a financial budget, implicit in that is an allocation of people's time, whether that be the CEO's time or junior salespeople's times. And you have to make sure, again, that there isn't a logical break somewhere along the way.
It's a really very interesting point. So, all right, I think we've really gotten to a really interesting point here. So we know that budgeting is super important. We know that it needs to follow a logical path, and we need to start with our business objectives and goals and work our way down from that. We've talked a little bit about how to do that. Make sure that you're trying to get good information. One thing we haven't talked about is how, like the old joke, no plan survives contact with the enemy. A lot of founders create this incredible budget in the first 3 months of their company and then put it in the metaphorical drawer and never come back to it. How do you think about budgeting and rebudgeting when the realities of your company start to come up?
Sure. So 2 things. Number 1, a budget should be something someone holds you accountable for. If you hold yourself accountable to it, that's great. If you have a board that holds you accountable to it, it's great. It should not be stuck in a drawer. Someone should go back and look at it and said, hey, did we meet our budget and goals and expectations? If not, where did we screw up? Was it a bad plan? Did something crazy happen? Did we exceed it? Right? You can obviously exceed your budget, in which case you were too, pessimistic or conservative. You should have someone holding you accountable to that budget. That could be your CFO. That could be you yourself if you're that diligent. That could be a board. Look back at it and amend your business plans for next year to be in light of that, or to make more realistic budgets next year.
I think it's a good one. So, we got a question, which is good. What would be the best possible way to be on a long journey as a bootstrap company? This is a great question. And so when you start to create a budget, and let's say that you're going to be bootstrapping, you're not going to be raising money, because there is those accountability steps almost built in. You have a board of directors, et cetera. But you're a bootstrapped company. How long should my budget last for? Should I build a 5-year pro forma? Should I build a 10-year pro forma? Should I start with a year? How should I think about that?
Sure. So that's a great question. And IdeaScale is a perfect example. So we're entirely bootstrapped. We've been in business 15 years, been profitable pretty much since day one. So we do create a budget, and I have a board of 1, right? The primary owner of the company's board, but he's separate from me as the CEO. And as CEO, I'm still, at the end of the day, still an employee of the company. So I create budgets about a year out, and I create a 5-year plan. The 5-year plan is different than the budget. The 5-year plan is more an aspirational statement of, okay, here's where we want to be in 5 years. I want to be a global company. I want to have XYZ revenues. I want to have this product suite. That's a plan, but it doesn't have any specifics behind it. I haven't reallocated resources behind it because I don't know what my resources will be. If we have a down year, I'll have less resources. If I have a great year, I'll have more resources to go aggressively after that plan. So I recommend making budgets for as long as you have visibility into the resource you will have available. Because going back to what I said at the beginning of this episode, budgets are a way to allocate resources. And if you don't know how many resources you will have 5 years out, you're allocating air, basically. You don't know what's going on, right? So make budgets for as far out as you have reasonable visibility into the resources you have available.
This is a
That's
good conversation. I want to hear.
Can you give an example, maybe anecdotally, of where a budget has gone wrong?
That's what I was going to ask, Anthony. I want to hear the worst fuck up. Like, what is the worst fuck up you've made on a budget?
Let's see. So I've certainly been, sometimes too optimistic on budgets. The worst thing that I have seen, and I personally did not do this, thankfully, I was the one responsible for cleaning it up, was a budget where someone had just, forgotten that they owed a bunch of money to the bank and they had to pay interest on it every month. They were like, hey, we're making $1 million.
Oh, that's a tough one.
Their math basically said, hey, we're making $500,000 of profit every month, which is actually right. But that was profit before they accounted for the $600,000 of interest they needed to pay the bank every month. So they were actually losing $100,000 because the actual core business, ignoring the banks, was very profitable.
Yeah, it was great.
Bringing in $500,000. It turns out at the end of each month, on the 31st of each month, you had to take, your $500,000 plus $100,000 from somewhere else and give it to the bank. And the bank certainly wanted their money every month, like clock.
They didn't know how to spell EBITDA is the problem.
Exactly. Yeah, I didn't want to get too technical, but yes, they did it on EBITDA. They forgot that EBITDA is earnings before interest, and all the other people you got to pay, and other people do want to be paid.
Interesting. So I sometimes, Nick, I love planning. I love spreadsheets. Like Anthony and I joke about when you get stressed, you go to the default thing that you do. I love building spreadsheets. Anthony likes to design. I like to build. But really the wisdom there is build a solid plan for where you have visibility and then stop. And then it's okay to kind of dream a little bit. Like, hey, I think if we can really hit these milestones in year 3, we could do this. In year 5, we could do this. And let that be more of a guidepost for the future. Does that sum it up?
Yeah, exactly. Like it's good and important to build plans because they give you a sense of where you're going and how you're allocating resources to get there. But it is unwise to plan out 100 years because to Anthony's point, no plan contact survives first contact. Imagine building a plan in 1920 for Ford, right? Could anybody have foreseen, the global economy, computers, LLMs, AI, right? Like it would be crazy to be building a 100-year plan in 1920 when Henry Ford was, out there building the Model T to build a 100-year plan. That would be crazy, or 100-year budget.
A little anecdote on that, and I can't remember the names, but I just saw a video on this where they really under budgeted Uber, and undervalued Uber when it first got started because they were looking at the entire market for taxi cabs, and that was the market size that Uber had, which is a gross underrepresentation of the opportunity, right?
So you're referring to an argument that was had by Uber's lead venture capitalist and a professor at NYU called Aswad Damodaran. They had a very public disagreement on this where Aswad Damodaran, very famous professor, was talking about, hey, Uber's basically the entire taxi cab market. Here's the math, and therefore Uber's worth $10 billion.
Yeah.
And the guy on the other side was saying, well, it's that plus all rental assets, plus delivery, plus a whole bunch of other stuff.
Now we're getting into Tam and Sam. This is great. Like we're covering the entire NBA gambit right now.
They just grossly underestimated the value of the market, which is usually not the case, right?
I don't. This is a little bit outside my expertise. I don't know whether people over or underestimate markets. In the case of Uber, I think the disagreement was on what markets they are targeting, number one, and how much value they can capture from that market. And obviously, over time, as we've seen, Uber prices have risen a lot since, well above inflation because Uber's fee or what they call their take rate is a hell of a lot higher than it was in 2012.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So let's get to the nitty gritty. Really interesting conversation. But I'm sitting down as an early stage founder and I'm starting to think about budget. And let's say that I was going to say bootstrap, but really you could be a funded company as well here. I think that cash probably plays the central role here. Just tell me how you think about constructing that budget early on and then contrast that with, okay, you're now in a 100-person company. That's a different animal where you're sitting than where, a 1 or 2 person company would be.
Sure. By the time you're a 100-person company or maybe 50, go hire a finance person. Make it someone who's, whose job and who's good at figuring out budgets and finance and cash flow. Call them a treasurer, controller, whatever you want. Someone who deals with the money side, and that's what they're good at. Hire someone to do it if that's not your area of expertise. If you're a kind of very, very early stage, you're 1, 2, 3 people, budgeting and stuff is not your expertise. Again, I would start with what you have available to you, right? So you've got $10,000 in the bank or $100,000 or $1 million in the bank, whatever that number is. Okay. Then think about how long you need to stretch that money out. Okay. So you've got $100,000 in the bank. You need to stretch that out for 2 years. That means you can only spend $50,000 a year unless you expect revenue to come in that covers that. And that, in which case, if you expect revenue to come in, you need to figure out how is that revenue coming in, how much is coming in. But start, as you said, Chris, with how much cash you have in the bank. And then I would add, figure out how long you need to stretch that given your whatever business model you are planning on operating under.
Where have you seen in your experience, and Anthony, I'll throw this to you as well, because you've worked with so many early stage companies. Where do things go wrong in that budgeting process? And what I mean by that is not the budget, but again, almost always those early stage, you just make you're not selling as much as you think, or you're growing faster than you think. How do you, as a budget, Nick, how do you reflect for that kind of unknown things? And then Anthony, weigh in on like what you've seen as far as where I should be thinking about that as a founder.
I'll offer two answers, then I'll pass to Anthony. Number one is there's uncertainty in your assumptions. Good budgets account for what's called uncertainty or risk, and technical term is you discount for risk, common parlance, you're making your budgets a little bit more conservative, realizing you're probably biased optimistically, and you want to be able to take shocks or external risks. That's number one. Number two, the second area where a lot of folks screw up on budgets is less the planning and optimism assumptions that everyone screws up on, but holding people accountable to holding to those budgets. So if you told your marketing person they have $20,000 to spend on advertising and they spend 25, that was you not holding them having proper governance. That person should be held accountable, or you should be held accountable for not setting guardrails and safeguards against them. There needs to be good governance. Otherwise budgets get broken.
I would, there's an and to that. So totally agree with you, Nick. There's two things that popped in my head. One is I've seen either on the positive or negative side, founders not constantly revisiting their budget and mapping actuals to budget. And therefore, if you're off 1 degree after 6 months, that 1 degree is a huge variance from where you're at. So that's one thing. The other thing that I feel that founders do is they treat budget as this is where I hope we go instead of a commitment. And that's kind of that underscores what you're saying, Nick. It's like, no, you committed to this revenue salesperson, so you missed it. Or I committed as a founder to hit this revenue number or to only spend this much. It's like, yeah, it's in my budget, but I didn't recognize it. You have to look at your budget as though you're going to move heaven and earth to hit that budget or exceed it. Exceed the top line, not the bottom line. So I do think, Nick, you're right. And those are, but the other things is that I see founders just not thinking about the numbers. They just don't follow through and look at the things that they need to be looking at on a monthly basis.
All right, quick hitter, Nick. Year 1, year 2, year 3. How much do you discount for risk? What's your percentage?
Sure. So the official number that you should be discounting is about 15% for year 1, 15% squared for year 2, 15% cubed for year 3. That is that's an actual number based on what's called the weighted average cost of capital, or the discount rate for risk in a venture business.
I was told there would be no math, Nick.
You asked for it. You asked for it. If you ask me for real math, I'm not going to make.
I think
not
real numbers.
That was such a great number.
This is where I love this conversation, because there is stuff that you as a finance person, you learned in the world of finance, and then you're applying it on a daily basis. And you understand that there's actually good application for it, and there's common sense. There's a lot of stuff when you're learning at business school, you're like, I don't really.
No. Most of what I learned at business school was garbage, but like the actual understanding of most of finance theory, people win Nobel Prize for it. You don't win Nobel Prizes for coming up with fluff. It's actually stuff that is like well proven and well researched.
I love it. This week could go on for 2 hours. Anthony, I don't know if you can, but sum this conversation. What is the lessons learned?
Yeah, I'll do my best here as I was taking notes. So I think we're on the how-to side, start with why. Start with why are you doing this and where are you trying to go, and align your budget with that company vision on what you're trying to do. And we didn't really talk about it much, but it's in my notes to separate fixed versus variable cost in your budget. And I would imagine,
Nick, right, Nick? Nail your expenses.
Yeah, I would imagine that risk factor, that 15%, is certainly much more weighted on the variable side than the fixed side. I would just assume that. Tell me if I'm wrong.
It should be the opposite, actually, because your fixed costs you have to pay no matter what. So it actually sucks if your revenues don't keep it, whereas your variable costs will scale down if you don't achieve your revenues.
Fair. I see how you flip that on me. Yeah, I totally agree with that, actually.
that was jujitsu right there, Nick. I like it.
So exactly the opposite of what I did. Be practical, and use AI to help research and sanity check your assumptions. Build in a contingency for unexpected events and risks. And Nick gave us this really great formula to use. Optimism is okay and expected. And I have in here one of the things that we also didn't get to, but I did want to cover. Especially when you're early stage and you don't have a lot of historical data to go by, I like to do what I call an ABC budget. So worst case, probable case, best case scenario budgets, and have 3 different budgets that you can, after a month, you can go, well, it looks like we're on the C track, or it looks like we're on the A track. So good, better, best kind of budget.
I also did the one that I would send to VCs, and then I did my real operating budget.
Exactly right. Don't tell them you're doing that, though. All right. So use data to forecast, avoid gut feeling budgeting. I think that's obvious. I have in here review monthly, even if you have a finance person. So you, as a founder or the CEO, you need to be kind of in the weeds on the budget and make sure that line items are matching up to budget as you're going through it month by month, and adjust as needed. Very important. Automate what's possible.
Sorry, one quick thing on that, Anthony, about a CEO reviewing the finances. Yes, we have a finance team, and yet every month I go through every single line item that we spent money on. Partially as a governance thing, just to have a second pair of eyes on it, make sure nothing bad is happening, but partially so that I am deep in the weeds on understanding how my business is operating, good and bad.
And I will say, I personally have made this mistake in the past, and it really bites you in the ass if you're not doing this on a monthly basis, line by line. I totally agree with you.
It's a full discipline piece, right?
Yeah. 2 more points. Involve your team. We touched on this a little bit, but if you're setting your revenue goals without involving your sales team, you're hallucinating. And same with marketing. So involve your team and be transparent in the budgets to boost accountability. Like Nick said, hold your team accountable when they don't hit the budgets they committed to. And then one last little tiny nit. Measure ROI for every major expense. Like, if you're going to spend a lot of money, make sure there's a return on that investment in some way that is measurable.
Well, my corporate masseuse makes my ROI for that is I'm really chill. I'm relaxed.
There's 10 jokes that I can't tell with that masseuse thing.
There's a great classic story, and it's too long for this one, but there's a guy that I know that used to go buy radio stations, and he's like, the worst ever expense he saw was they had a on-staff masseuse that would go in to the DJs because it's such a stressful job and give them.
Well, Google had you for a long time had on campus masseuses and barbers and stuff. So
yeah, that's pretty good. All right, deep dive. I think there's a few. One obviously, lean startup. Lean startup is great. I don't think it necessarily hits exactly what we're talking about. Hey, Anthony, and this is great because Nick, it's the Harvard.
Did you mention profit first?
Harvard Business Review. I was going to end with that one, Anthony.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Harvard Business Review. How to build a budget that drives growth. There's a great TED Talk called "Why Budgeting Isn't Boring" by Carl Richards. And there's a terrific book. Thank you for stealing my thunder, Anthony.
Sorry.
Called Profit First by Mike Malowicz. I still can't say his name. But Nick, awesome conversation, man.
Yeah.
Give me anything else, like from a budgeting perspective first, what else other takeaways do you have? And then let's talk about you. Where can we follow you? I'm a fan. You can come be a CEO of my one-person company. It'd be great.
Thank you. So the one thing I'll add, I think we briefly touched on, but it's important to just break out as its own point, is cash is king. Sometimes people get lost in all the accounting and the EBITDA and the amortization and the growth and capitalization, all that stuff. At the end of the day, the only money that's real is cash. Cash in, cash out. And always tie things back to whether you call it cash accounting or cash budgeting, which is very, very different than accounting-based budgeting.
I love that. Yeah, it is a very simple mistake when people come out of business school and they're like, look, here's my assets and here's my balance sheet. It's like, I don't give a fuck about your balance sheet. How much I care about one line item in your balance sheet, like how much cash you have and how long does that last? That's it.
I was just as a fun aside, like I was looking at acquiring a competitor and they showed, these great hockey stick financials and all this stuff. And I just looked at their balance sheet. It's like your cash has gone down every month since you were founded 10 years ago. Please explain why this is a good business.
Exactly. This is not a good business. Unless you're Amazon, in which case, you're growing.
No, but Amazon's been making money for a long time. They actually people criticize Amazon they've actually been making money for like 15 years at this point.
Oh, and when they decided to turn on profitability, they're like, fuck you, profitability.
Yeah.
It was crazy. All right. So Nick,
they were, it's weird. And I don't understand the accounting or the how they did this, but on paper they weren't profitable, but they were cash rich.
Yeah.
They flowed in an amazingly well.
You would need a theoretical physicist or theoretical mathematician like Nick to be able to figure that out.
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell us more about you, Nick. Where can we follow you? Where can we find more information? Tell us about your company. It seems really, really cool.
So IdeaScale, as I mentioned, is the largest innovation software company in the world. Our customers are huge organizations, Pfizer, Comcast, US Post Office, hospital systems, you name it. Our software is like a TikTok or social network for ideas. People post ideas, other people vote ideas up and down. Best ideas rise to the top and land on the CEO's desk. And this is a great way for an organization that's got 10,000 people, 100,000 people, 1,000 people, whatever it is, to get all those great ideas for how to make their company or organization better and get them in front of the CEO or the decision maker super fast with the highest, best ideas. That's what we've been doing for 15 years. We're really good at it. We're the biggest company in the world that does this. We're in 25 countries with employees in 8 of them. So doing really well there. Our software is completely free for organizations or teams less than 100 people. So if you're an individual entrepreneur or you are a 99-person team at $1 billion company, software is completely free. Go check it out. IdeaScale.com, entirely online, takes 30 seconds to use. So it's pretty cool. If you can sign up for TikTok, you can use IdeaScale. As for me personally, best way to find me is on LinkedIn. My name is Nick Jain. It's down at the bottom of the screen. If you want to DM me, please do. I respond to 100% of messages.
That's amazing. I think we should implement IdeaScale for us for this podcast, Anthony, but it would be just me and you making shitty comments. It's like, my idea is Anthony should talk less. My idea is that Chris should talk less. Like it would just.
Well, you can have your audience participate too. Your audience can submit their ideas, and they can vote on whether they want Anthony to speak less, or maybe they want him to speak more.
I was going to say it would just be like,
I don't want to know the answer to that question, Nick.
Yeah.
No, I do.
I don't know that I want to know. Exactly.
I'll pass on that. Thank you very much.
We'll let you vote, and Nick will be like, just actually both of you.
Just stop.
Let me just explain
just
what's
stop.
going on.
Why are you guys doing this?
Anthony,
in the first
get
place?
us out
This
of
is gonna be
here.
the
Really good conversation. Nick, thank you
It's
so
great
much for the
conversation.
time. What do we got coming up?
So next week we're going to talk about B2B sales strategies with a guest, Ann Carden. And for us, remember to follow us on linkedin.com/company/howtofounder, or just go to our How to Founder website, howtofounder.com, where you can find us on Apple, Spotify, our iHeart, YouTube, all of the internets where you can find us. Nick, really great conversation. I really appreciate you joining us, and wish you everything but the best of luck at IdeaScale.
Yeah, go try IdeaScale, man. Sounds amazing.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.